Hello everyone. In this video, we will examine how to write the introduction for the IB Physics practical reports. So for your introduction, you're going to write it in paragraph form, okay? And in broad strokes, the introduction allows you to set the topic and context of the investigation, discuss the background theory, so any sort of scientific theory or formulas or concepts that are needed to understand the investigation, and have that lead into sort of the purpose of the investigation. That's sort of in broad strokes how the intro works. So for that background information, it's worth noting you don't need to start from the beginning. So you don't need a first sentence that says like, in the beginning there was the Big Bang and, all of physics was discovered. You don't need to do that. You just need to sort of dive right into the scientific topic. So what is this investigation about scientifically? And you can start a little bit broader and narrow in, okay? And you're going to justify in this sort of section the choice of the research question from a personal and scientific perspective. So as you write in about this background information, you want to weave in text, weave in sort of reasoning that says or suggests why this is worth investigating. Why is this topic worth investigating? And you can do that from both a personal and a scientific perspective. You're welcome to go overboard with the personal perspective for just a little bit. It makes everybody feel better. That is, you can write sentences, if you like, that say, I've always had a personal interest in the acceleration due to gravity from the time I was a young age. It's worth noting that you shouldn't do that on your final IA, and that's not necessary, but often it makes students feel better. But what I mean is you should justify the choice, okay? Justify the choice from a scientific perspective. So not why are you interested in it, but why is this question interesting from a scientific perspective, from anyone's scientific perspective? That's what that justification looks like. You want to make sure that the scientific information that you give is appropriate, so not too trivial, not too advanced. It doesn't need to be beyond the scope of the course. Nor does it need to sort of start with a definition of what is position, okay? So you can sort of jump into it and then explain the relevant physics to be considered. And make sure that the physics that you explain is relevant, so you don't need to go off on tangents. You also don't need historical information. So in general, you probably shouldn't have a date. You don't need to say, sort of name drop important scientists along the way. You should just give the scientific information that's necessary. And it should include the relevant scientific theory at a mathematical and qualitative level of description. So if we're going to use a formula later on, if we're going to apply some kind of calculation to whatever it is that we're doing, you want to explain that formula or perhaps derive that formula with text that sort of shows what it is that we're doing with it. Okay, so for example, in this first experiment, you can assume the Suvat equations, but show how those Suvat equations apply to this particular experiment. And then you're going to have that lead into a what once may have been called a hypothesis, but is really just your theoretical prediction. And it is really important that you sort of move past sort of the 9th grade level of this. Like, we have a genuine expectation for the relationship between the variables to be investigated. That is what is going to happen here. So you can say, like, with confidence, not as if it were just a guess, what we expect to find is this relationship. And it should be at more than a qualitative level, although you need the qualitative level as well. So for example, if you say as the height increases for the drop of the ball, then the time should increase. That's great. But more specifically, you should give the mathematical relationship that is expected between the height and the time, and you should show why that's expected, and you should show the value that you expect once you linearize your data. So this is sort of a full explanation. This right here is the explanation of what are you going to do with the data that you collect. Okay, so where are you going with this? Ensure that your information, scientific theory, and literature value is correctly referenced and cited if need be. So in this case, if you're using our textbook, you don't need to cite that scientific theory. But if you're using a literature value later in the lab, for example, the acceleration due to gravity, that should be referenced and cited. Okay, so you should use a particular value. And all of that should lead to the following two distinct sections. The aim, that is, what is the broad purpose of this investigation? What quantity is being measured? This is the big picture answer to the question, why are we doing this? What is the purpose, broadly speaking, of the investigation? An answer to this question would be, or could be something like, we are determining this value for this reason. Okay? And then you're going to want to very, very briefly, in just a couple of sentences, answer the question, how will the aim be met? And that is the 2-sentence summary of the lab that you are about to do. So how are you going to answer this question? How are you going to meet this aim? And if necessary, you want to include a diagram with labeled variables and quantities right here. And then you should also have a narrow focused research question. So that has been given for you in the acceleration due to gravity lab, and it is just a question that restates the specific relationship between the dependent and independent variables. Okay, you want to give a little more detail than just inserting the variable. So for example, you could start with, how does the time depend on the height? But it's much better to ask a more specific relationship there. That is, how does the time it takes for a ball to drop depend on the height from which it is dropped, for example. And the aim in research question should form sort of the end of your introduction. Everything above in here should lead to your aim and your research question.